A very good sunny evening to you all, and welcome to our last party broadcast until after the elections. Tonight, our host is the eminent Dr. Ranjit Brar, so I'll pass you over without further ado. Thanks, Ranjit.
Thanks very much, Tess. Can you hear me okay? Fantastic. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. As you know, we're building up towards the elections on the 6th, and we are standing across the country as the Workers' Party. And one of the key things, one of the key tenets of our program, as perhaps you saw on the introduction to this meeting, or you've seen if you've read our 10-point program, and I'd please ask and encourage every one of you who hasn't, please to do so. But one of the tenets of our party is that we believe in free and comprehensive healthcare with no waiting lists, accompanied by easy access to cheap and nutritious food. So healthcare, nutrition, these are things that we are seeing we can no longer take for granted. The National Health Service was declared at the time of perhaps the 2012 Olympics, if you remember, to be the last religion of the British people, an institution which had almost universal support, though occasionally is denounced by Tory backbencher MPs as being a Stalinist institution, by which they essentially mean a social institution which is not delivered on a for-profit basis, which is anathema to their fundamental ideology. But nevertheless, the British people, having experienced the NHS, having had our children born in the NHS, our elderly people cared for in the NHS, it's there for us when we're sick. We rely upon it, all of us, and it's an incredible institution of essentially social welfare. Because we only need to look as far as the United States to realize the kind of bills which accrue with even relatively simple illnesses if we are treated by a totally for-profit healthcare system. And as such, we all rely and depend on it as an institution. And therefore, it's become impossible openly to attack the NHS and to openly express a desire to get rid of it, privatize it, make it for-profit institution, openly say we're going to embrace the market in healthcare to the extent that the United States has done. And yet that has been the very persistent direction of travel, certainly for the last 40 years since the Thatcher administration. Arguably, even before that point, the seeds of future reprivatization were laid from the beginnings of the institution. But certainly since the Thatcher administration, there's been a very joined up policy of progressive privatization. With us tonight, we're very lucky to have Bob Gill, an NHS GP and campaigner, who has done perhaps more than any other single individual. I can think of others, perhaps Alison Pollock, but Bob really, for me, done more than any single individual to expose and unmask the precise mechanisms which are still unfolding daily before us, particularly at the time of the pandemic, which are driving that agenda home. And I'm sorry to say, that left unchecked, we're very near to the completion of that process. So we in the Workers' Party are very clear that we're fighting against privatization, but also we must start a fight for true renationalization of the healthcare sector in our country, because it is under severe threat. Very briefly, if I outline the things that have brought us here, they were the sidelining of the clinicians from being the main manager of the hospitals and introducing a set of managers who are at one with the corporate elite, and the introduction of a revolving door between healthcare and the business sector. They were the introduction of the internal market, which meant that trusts no longer would just simply provide services and plan on a national and regional basis for how much care would be needed and provided, but would now start buying and selling and contractualizing that care between branches of the organization, particularly between primary and secondary care, between your GP and your hospitals and other services that they refer you to. Beyond that, we've seen, of course, the New Labour introduced the private finance initiative, which was a massive marketization, rebuilding of hospitals and healthcare facilities, which have been starved of resources, was financed by banking consortia, and private finance initiatives for private capital, private banks essentially, who have lent about 12-13 billion pounds for rebuilding of hospitals, and then will expect to be repaid in the order of 90-95 billion pounds, at the end of which huge mortgages, a period of time over 40 or 60 or years. In fact, the whole of those hospitals won't belong to the NHS, but they'll still belong to the private consortia who initially bankrolled them. So this is a steady bleeding of the funds. The management itself now has grown from being 3 or 4% of the overall budget of the NHS to around 20%. The PFI is an ever-increasing segment of the funding of the institution. And therefore, you'd see, despite the apparently large figures which go into the health, over 140 billion pounds a year, that we see relative and absolute underfunding, under-resourcing, diminution in the number of beds, so a reduction in overall capacity, reduction in staff, reduction in frontline services, and increasingly, and driven home by the pandemic, we're finding it harder as individuals to access NHS care, to access a GP, to actually get examined by a professional. Why is it, we kind of understood for a period of time that there was a risk of face-to-face contact, and it might be necessary to defer some level of care. We built such an enormous waiting list, even prior to the pandemic, but accentuated by the pandemic. And now we are in the middle of a process whereby many of these telephone consultations, video consultations, will be made a permanent feature of working, which will further diminish access to care. And by diminishing access to care, those who can afford it will be encouraged to have insurance to get around these larger and larger waiting lists. And in this way, we'll gradually all be forced into taking out insurance. Simultaneously to that, we have seen the way in which the NHS Social Care Act of 2012 came in, actually abolished the government's overall responsibility for providing healthcare to all of the citizens of Britain, and instead farmed it out to a quango. That quango, NHS England, is headed by Sir Simon Stevens, himself a sign of the insurance industry. And the majority of the funding for the NHS was farmed out to GPs, these clinical commissioning groups, who then essentially have the job of rationing care locally. And because they can't plan adequately, they've brought a large number of private consulting firms in to manage that. And increasingly now we're seeing the merger and takeover essentially of the planning and governance and provision of care by large health insurance industry, particularly with the Centene, who recently bought out AT Medics, for example, but it's not the only example. Virgin, we've said for a long time, Richard Branson is the country's biggest GP, having over 3 million GP patients, is also started to take over hospitals. And there are many, companies who are involved in this process of bidding for and taking over NHS contracts, increasing the amount of private profit which is drawn out and decreasing overall the amount of funds which are left for frontline care. Now, I think it is of note to see a couple of things about the pandemic as well. That the response to the pandemic, which is a real phenomenon, but you can understand the level of distrust in certain sections of the community who don't even accept that there is a real pandemic, precisely because it's being used for corruption, cronyism, and driving home of pre-planned policies, whether that's in the field of the Police, Crime and Courts Act, whether that's in the form of the Corona Bill planning legislation, or whether that's in the form of just huge amounts of money, which under the slogan of protecting the NHS, in fact, has been doing the opposite, not going to the NHS, but leaving the NHS starved of resources and going into private sector cronies who are providing services, however poorly. And so we've seen Test, Track and Trace, for example, having 42 to 45 billion. That is not money that's going to the NHS. That is money that's going into the private sector to perform jobs poorly, in a poorly coordinated way with local services, at the same time as the health infrastructure, the local health infrastructure has actually been wound up and destroyed first by NHS 2012, and now in the face of the latest reforms, which I know Bob is going to talk to you about. And it's of note, as typifying the kind of whole approach of our serial governments towards the state, that it is a mechanism to take funds under the guise of apparently performing public service, but to take these huge amounts of funding centralized in the state and to farm it out to private capital, to the cronies of the government officials, that we can see the Greensill affair. I really do think it's worth pausing to think about that. It's increasingly in the news that top civil servants, but also top NHS officials, including Matt Hancock, including Dido Harding, including Sir Simon Stevens, were all involved in meetings with Greensill, whose essential plan was to get hold of these huge, was to bankroll, actually. He had an advance payment scheme, so he would pay wages in advance on a daily or weekly basis. In that way, the NHS would owe him money. He would pile up this debt as a collateralized debt obligation, float it on the stock exchange as a complex derivative of the kind which was associated previously with the banking crisis of 2008. As that scheme has collapsed, that has led to the whole challenging of a number of people who he bankrolled, including, of course, the famous Indian billionaire, Sanjeev Gupta, who was the main bankroller of Liberty Steel and various other industrial organizations and sectors, which will lead to mass redundancies in working class communities across the North and the Midlands, including Hartlepool, where, of course, the current general election, by-election, will be taking place. And linked to that has been former Prime Minister David Cameron, but also the current Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and the whole management infrastructure of our NHS and government, who are very clearly to be seen taking money, putting it in the hands of their wealthy sponsors in order to be further rewarded. And it's precisely in this way that we have to look at what Tony Blair has previously done in privatizing the NHS, but also waging wars on Iraq, et cetera, on making sure that our government, in fact, fully follows not the will of the majority of the British people, but in fact the will of a small business elite in the city of London. And it's precisely why Tony Blair's consulting company now is key in managing the affairs of government around the world in accordance with the interests of the financial elite, and why he himself has amassed a fortune of many hundreds of millions of pounds, though the precise figure is opaque. So, having given this introduction about how the NHS itself is tied up while it's being managed by this current government, but also the past government of Tony Blair, how it's being driven down the road persistently of privatization, I'd love Bob Deal to come and tell us a little bit about the current plans, because, towards the end of the pandemic, announcements have been made by Matt Hancock and by Boris Johnson that they want to roll back some aspect of the Health and Social Care Act. And we've been given over to believe that this is going to be a reversal of direction of the general direction of privatization. But in fact, the reverse is the case. It's a ratcheting up of that mechanism. Bob has done a great deal to study this and uncover it. And it's a great pleasure to introduce Bob, who'll now tell us some more about that and his other thoughts on the current direction of travel in the NHS. Thanks so much, Bob.
Thank you, Ranjit. Thank you for that great summary of the background. I'm sure nobody listening to this broadcast will be surprised to be told that the rolling back of privatization is a blatant lie. Before I go into the detail of the latest proposed shakeup, I just want to underline some of the points you made around how we got into the pandemic and what the pandemic has been used to cover. You rightly point out that this is really a corporate asset grab. The NHS, you could divide up into a series of assets. You have the land and the buildings. And as you rightly pointed out, PFI debt has been used as a financial mechanism to create a plausible narrative to flog off land. So you have a land grab. Another part of the asset grab is the NHS data. NHS data set is probably the most valuable data set in the world. And we've seen during the pandemic companies like Palantir, which have links to the security state within America and close allies to Donald Trump. They were offered access to data collection during the pandemic. But companies like Google also have been given free rein in terms of NHS data. And one example was the Royal Free Hospital gave them over millions of patient records. So you have a data grab. Data is the new gold and has a potential enormous commercial value. And the final asset grab is the budget asset grab. For argument's sake, let's say 120 billion pounds worth of taxpayers' money goes into the NHS. Well, if somebody could shoehorn their way into the flow of that 120 billion and siphon away as much as possible, that's a pretty good gig. And that's what the American insurance industry is doing as we speak and has been doing for many years, in fact. Just to remind you, the chief executive of the NHS is a man called Simon Stevens, who was formerly president for global expansion for United Health. And some of the research we've done when I produced the film, The Great NHS Heist, showed that their personnel, their modus operandi, contracts that have been awarded cover much of the country, certainly in England. So you have insurance industry top executives running the NHS. You have their personnel involved in training NHS leaders and managers into the ways of working of the insurance industry. And you have they're very well placed in positions of power and decision-making roles, which will create an equivalent opportunity for them that they have in America. Now, America is the most privatized system, and privatized healthcare is only interested in profit. But within that system, there are clear failures. The market is not interested in people who don't have money and people who are expensive. So in those two circumstances, you have the US taxpayer having to foot the bill through Medicare and through Medicaid. Now, United Health have positioned themselves into controlling the flows of those monies. So they are positioned and they designed the mechanisms for the flow of that money. Now, that's exactly the position they want to achieve within the NHS, to control the flow of money. Before I move on to that in a bit more detail, what's been my experience of how the government has handled the pandemic? Well, in the beginning of the lockdown last year, myself and many of my colleagues were left twiddling our thumbs. We were completely sidelined from the response to the pandemic. The control was handed over to a predominantly privatized and outsourced system called NHS 111. So the GPs were left out of the picture. We couldn't organize tests if we wanted to. The other thing we were losing out was developing clinical experience of dealing with people with suspected COVID. So not only are they damaging our potential medical experience for the future, but we were left out of the whole response. And what were they doing in the meantime? They were investing heavily in creating parallel structures, not learning the lessons from the 2012 Act, where they were clearly warned, do not decimate public health, do not disinvest in public health, do not dumb down the leadership of public health, and don't sell off the labs. Well, they ignored all that advice. Rather than learning the lessons as the death toll mounted, they've doubled down on their ideology and spent billions via Serco, via Deloitte, via various other subcontractors to create a system which is worse than the struggling NHS is. It performs worse than the NHS labs do. They also refuse to take up offers of universities labs who are vacant and willing to help, of no charge. Rather than taking what existed and what could have been rebuilt up, they chose to bypass it all, and in the process have created labs called Lighthouse Labs, which are doing a lot of the testing. So rationally speaking, none of this can be defended in terms of economics or just simple logic. Ranjit mentioned telemedicine. Yes, this has been normalized, but the plans for increasing telemedicine predated the pandemic. And, although a lot of my colleagues think it's great, but, you cannot argue you can make the same assessment over the phone or over a video link without laying a hand on the patient. Inadvertently, they are breaking their connection with the patient. And part of that breaking of the connection is the downskilling. Now, in 2019, there was a major change to the GP contract. It was presented as a minor tweaking, but in fact, it's the biggest change since 1948. And it was railroaded through by our own union, the British Medical Association, with no debate and no vote of the membership. And what it actually creates, it's creating these new organizations called primary care networks. Now, it all sounds fantastic, collaboration and all the rest. But if you drill down into the detail, any new money that was coming in to pay for personnel within general practice was not going to be spent on recruiting more doctors. That was banned. That money had to be spent on recruiting non-doctors. So you have a very deliberate policy decision to reduce the number of doctors, to reduce your access to a doctor, and replace it by people who are less qualified. What's the problem with that? You might say, well, if you have clinical members of the team who have a less experience and naturally a larger blind spot, the unknown unknowns, combined with potentially the confidence that comes with ignorance, a phenomena called the Dunning-Kruger syndrome, whereby a novice can act with great confidence based on little knowledge and make a lot of mistakes. Combined with a large blind spot, this is potentially fatal. Now, I'll give you an example of the future. The future is you go to, if you can get through to somebody at your GP surgery, the receptionist will be empowered to decide who you see. Do you see a doctor or do you see, let's say, for example, a physiotherapist? Well, if you're presenting with shoulder pain, the receptionist could, quite rationally say, I think you should see the physiotherapist. So you're a 20-year-old female who goes in to see the physiotherapist with shoulder pain. Physiotherapist does a competent job, assesses your shoulder, advises you on exercises, sends you home, where you go and collapse in your front room and die. What's happened there? The physiotherapist didn't ask about whether you could be pregnant and whether the shoulder pain was in fact referred pain from an abdominal bleed, which can be referred, if it irritates your diaphragm, to your shoulder. This is the problem with the whole approach of the downskilling and the blocking of access. Another barrier they've introduced, and you may have seen the adverts on TV, is the 111 first telephone helpline. What that is trying to do is to block you even turning up at A&E. So in due course, if you turn up at A&E without a prior phone call and without permission, you will not be seen. We'll get to the stage where you're turned away from A&E. Ranjit touched crucially on how the leadership and the management of the NHS has been expanded hugely, but being appointed, and people who are in charge now, you are not allowed to hold and practice a public service ethos. You have to be totally aligned with top-down policy change. If not, you're out. You just wouldn't get in. The situation has got to such an extent that I'll remind you, in the summer of last year, an instruction was issued by NHS England and money was provided, billions were provided for elderly patients within hospital to be discharged en masse into nursing homes without being tested, leading to another outbreak costing over 20,000 lives. Now, I put it to you that the NHS and the clinical power within the NHS is so diminished that we were able to be bullied into setting off a deadly spike in infection and death within our nursing homes. Now, just a bit of detail on what's being proposed with this recent NHS shake-up and the supposed pulling back on privatization. Well, it's nothing of the sort. What the government want to do is build on these primary care networks, which I mentioned, which was a way of pooling GP surgeries, incentivizing and forcing their closure and merger, with the view to gaining control of their income streams, which is based on their patient list size. So it's a mechanism for ultimately pooling all the budgets of a population of between 1 and 2 million, and ultimately handing control of those budgets to United Health Optum, and introducing something they term as population health management, which is where you have a defined budget of money within which, if you save money, that is profit. So the incentives for this new system will be to deny care, which is exactly what the insurers do, because spending money on patients affects your bottom line, affects your profits. So there will be incentives within the primary care networks for the remaining GPs to deny patients care, and they will be able to benefit from something called a shared savings scheme. So a totally perverse incentive for your doctor to act against the interest of patients. And in order to achieve these goals, they are going to make it less and less down to an individual. They will introduce mechanisms to analyze your referral rates, to analyze your prescribing, to analyze your population. Data analytics and algorithms will determine what happens to your patient. So in effect, the doctor or the nurse is no longer your patient's advocate. You just have to submit your proposal for a referral, and the computer will say yes or no. So they've even taken the what might have been an obstacle for a human to interact with a decision and have to battle with their conscience about denying care. Well, that's going to be taken out of the system as well. So it's in fact, it's a from a profit point of view, it's an advance on what they're doing in the States. But the impact on our patients will be preventable harm and preventable death in due course. So that is the nature of these proposals. The awareness amongst NHS GPs and doctors generally is next to zero, largely because our media never report any of this, largely because the think tanks that deal with healthcare are also part of the problem. Many of them have come through the revolving door. They're former McKinsey consultants or Big Four accountancy firm economists who've ended up in think tanks. In fact, I believe that Simon Stevens was part of the Commonwealth Fund think tank. And in fact, United Health bought out an American think tank that was previously had a very high reputation. So they're silencing all avenues of dissent, and they're keeping people in the dark as much as possible. And to our shame, our union has been a very important tool for them to use against us. And, it's thanks to groups like yourselves, having meetings like this, that we can break through this wall of silence to expose the truth. Thank you.
Bob, thank you so much. Extremely powerful contribution. I think at some point, I had myself over the years many times have looked to see what former secretaries of state for health are doing now. And it's remarkable to see, from Alan Milburn to Patricia Hewitt to certainly Jeremy Hunt, who never wanted to give up the position, wanted to drive this agenda through, wanted to relentlessly pursue junior doctors, junior nurses, make sure he could do his best to cheapen the wage bill and maximize the penetration of finance capital. See who their consultancies are, see who they now work for, see who their private part-time appointments on boards are for. It is incredible to see the way in which our ministers have been compromised. What are they thinking about? How could they do it? They could do it because they are being paid. Their wallets are stuffed full, frankly, of blood money as they are taking an axe to our national health. And it's something that we see across the board in our public services. Well, there are two statements probably which sandwich this entire pandemic for me. There was the kind of opening statement of Boris Johnson's special advisor at the time, Dominic Cummings, who of course famously said a strategy for managing the pandemic would be herd immunity, protect the economy, and if a few pensioners died, so be it. Clearly stating the orientation of the government is about money. It's about business. It's about maximizing the profit for the few and forget the rest. And it was really in the face of the collapse of the stock exchange. And don't forget, we're in the middle of a depression, which is triggered by, but not synonymous with, the pandemic. That suddenly there was huge furlough schemes and bailouts, and actually tens and hundreds of billions, probably over the course of 2 to 3 years, in the region of 700 or 800 billion. So an amount of money equivalent to the 2008 crisis will be pumped primarily to big industry. That's not just the track and trace, that's the direct bailing out, the wage bill, so-called, the scheme that Greensill was trying to get access to when David Cameron was texting again and again, Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, Matt Hancock, who was texting them to try and get some of those funds to bail out his banker, who now is his, paying his enormous salary. So there was this on the one hand, just going into the pandemic, this is what was going, and that essentially was what we had. We had herd immunity punctuated by lockdowns, which dampened down the wave, and then take a foot off the gas and herd immunity again, with the NHS being overwhelmed really almost continuously, but with slight dip for recovery in between. And it's only vaccination that's got us out of that mess, which would have cost probably many hundreds of thousands of lives left unchecked. And then come right to the other end. And Boris Johnson, speaking to the 1922 committee of backbench Conservative MPs, said, we've done a fantastic job, and we could attribute it all to greed and capitalism, in his own words. So this is absolutely what has underlined the entire response to the pandemic, as indeed the response to every question, how best to facilitate the looting of the treasury, but also the ongoing exploitation of the workers of Britain and the wider world. So we must bear this in mind. We must subject the hollow words that government ministers stand up and speak from the dispatch box with the actual deeds, and see that the class that they serve richly rewards them for their services in office. Now, apparently, when they're still in office, it used to be traditionally when they were out of office, but now it's okay. They can have the secondary jobs and consultancies. And we've seen that a top civil servant, talking to Greensill, was happy to have these consultancies while dealing with the disposal of 40 billion, worth of ostensibly our money, taxpayers' money. This is what we're dealing with. This is a politics that runs through and through, I'm afraid, Labour Party, Tory Party, Liberal Party. This is the stuff of bourgeois politics. It's why so many people are disillusioned from politics. It's why our party, the Workers' Party, is desperately trying to build an alternative force which really represents working people, to build a new working class politics in our country. But to tell us more now about the impacts on particularly mental health and the care of mental health is one of our party members and a mental health nurse, Liam Stoll. So I'll hand over to Liam. Liam, thanks so much for being with us and telling us more about your experience of what's going on in the NHS.
No worries. Good evening, everyone. It will come as no surprise that the mental health system's in a similar crisis to other aspects of the NHS, and that has become increasingly privatised over recent years. And this has come in a number of waves over probably the past 20 to 30 years. One of the biggest movements was the initial, in the pharmaceutical industry, of the manufacturing of Prozac or fluoxetine, which was the antidepressant medication, which for most people, sadness or depression, or whatever you want to call it, is something that we will all probably experience at some point of our lives. So it became instantly marketable to the entire population, which meant, especially in America, this could be promoted just constantly and advertised. And obviously that's not possible in the UK, but instead what would be advertised would be depression itself. And that meant they would fund certain things, whether that would be celebrities or charities, in order to promote this state of mind or illness or whatever you want to call it, so they could promote this drug to a mass population. And obviously it helps some people in distress, but sadly the evidence shows that for lots of people it can have significant side effects, and it doesn't work. And interestingly, in the NHS we have two main rating scales for which GPs use and mental health practitioners use, which is the GAD and the PHQ. And what these rating scales do is there's a few questions which can somehow figure out your state of mind, your personality, and how you're feeling by asking symptoms, or what I like to call it sort of states of minds, or just how you feel, or reactions to distress. And if you rate high on these scales, it indicates, according to the scale, that you require medication. And you think, well, who made up these scales? It was Pfizer. Pfizer produced both of these rating scales, and out of the goodness of their hearts, gave them to the NHS for free. So you have to think, why would they do this? And of course, it's to sell on absolute mass scale these medications to people, because mental health services weren't able to provide the talking therapies or all the things that people may need, because the amount of people that would come in feeling this way or stating they are struggling with things that happen in their lives meant we had to resort to medication, because the absolute amount of people that coming into services was not manageable whatsoever. And that continues, and that's one of the next models was the Iaps Model, which New Labour introduced, and this was their flagship mental health programme, which on face value everyone applauded. It stands for improving access to psychological therapies, but what that does is offer individuals who are highly distressed very short and brief interventions of 6 to 12 sessions. And for some people that works, but for once again, the majority of people to be able to resolve such high levels of trauma and distress in a short period of time. And what it does is focus on you as an individual, what is wrong with you, not what's happened to you, not what's happening in society around you. You become the problem. And then that becomes a problem in itself, because once again, waiting lists build up, and that's what the market wants in order to then say NHS services can't cope. So there's two options where services get privatised or it's medication, both which are obviously privately owned. And this is where we come unstuck in mental health services, because we cannot maintain the influx of people coming through. So the answer, as the markets do, is what do we need? Well, we need more mental health services. And yes, that I suppose that is one answer, but we can't just constantly deal with the effects if we don't deal with the underlying cause, which is, we've had 10 years of austerity, which is cuts to social care, education, this mass unemployment, this cuts to other health services. And this is what's driving the mental health crisis. If we just create more mental health services, that just creates more patients. And we've had an increase in suicide over the last 10 years. Over recent months, there's been a significant increase. And that's because, as has been alluded to, the support networks of people have just slowly eroded away, especially, people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and working class backgrounds that require and need that human input, that face-to-face input, which is no longer possible. So it's just, you're seeing on a rating scale, you're seeing as a number. And this is what's used in mental health services and increasingly in health services in general, rather than understanding what's happened to you in your life. And I work with children in crisis, and that are children that are sadly trying to take their own lives. And once again, it's the focus constantly in services is what's wrong with this child, is very rarely what's happened to them. And for me, this is the tragic reality of things. It's because then we can sell drugs. We have children as young as 4 years old on amphetamine-based drugs. We have children equally as young on antidepressant, anti-anxiety medication, because society feels they cannot manage them. So it's easier to sedate them or to ghettoize them into places where they're all together. And, I've seen this firsthand when I've worked in youth justice service as well, which is what I did prior to this. And I did some research in the local areas that I worked, and it was staggering to see some of the things that were happening there, such as 80% of young people had either been a victim or witnessed domestic violence. 70% were from single parent families. 70 to 80% were unemployed in this area. We had 60 to 70% which had family members that were either in the prison system or had been in the prison system. And there's a huge gender bias when it comes to services. So we have, in youth justice services, up to 90% tends to be male, whilst in mental health services, it's around 80% female. But both come from the same areas, the same difficulties, yet one gets taken down the youth justice system, one gets taken down the mental health system. And it's awful to watch. And the young women that were in the youth justice system, and this to me is the most staggering thing, 100% of them had been sexually abused. And what do we do as a society? We struggle we can't empathise that, we don't have compassion, we lock them up, we medicate them, we see them as the problem rather than what's happened to them. And this is the tragedy of what's happening in mental health services and social services, where young people essentially get trafficked around the country because a list of their most problematic behaviours gets put on a sheet and a price gets attached to them. Because we don't have state-run children's homes really anymore. It's all completely privatised, where they buy up cheap properties around the country and put in, sadly, underskilled, low-paid staff who, rightly so, are not equipped to manage the most complex people in our society. But these companies know all they need to do, they can get rid of one because there'll be another child in next. And this is thousands of pounds a week. And it's just a revolving door and nothing ever gets resolved. And it's awful. And I truly believe, and to go back to one of the points of my programme, that we need a fully nationalised health and social services to be able to help the most traumatised and distressed people in our society. And I believe the only way to do that is socialism, because the current system just isn't working. We're creating a complete underclass of society, which all we can do is lock them up, or we medicate to sedate them to a point where they can be managed in society, and it's awful. I think that's probably all I can say on that matter, and I think there's probably enough there. But yeah, it's like I say, it's a really awful situation at present.
Liam, thanks so much. A harrowing account of the problems we're facing, not just in the NHS, but a reflection of the problems we're facing in wider society. I mean, going into the pandemic, it's very hard now to get a handle on what are the real unemployed rates. But you're right, unemployment is a social disease that's a breeding ground for physical and mental illness. It's a total waste of the potentialities of working people. Our dignity, our pride, our identity comes from the work we do and engaging constructively with society. And of course, there are going to be tremendous knock-on from the level of unemployment we're seeing. Going into this pandemic, like I said, the unemployment figures have been so massaged. There's lies, damn lies, and statistics, and unemployment figures definitely fit into that category. But what you can see, a rate that is published, is something called the rate of economic inactivity. And the economically inactive population are those of working age, so between 18 and the retirement age, 65 or 67, who are not working. So they're of working age, but they're not working. And going into the pandemic, that was a rate in excess of 26%. So it was already a quarter of the population of working age are not working. If you consider that the working population in our country is essentially 30 million people, because the others are either too old or actually more often too old rather than too young to work. You're talking about huge numbers of people, a quarter of 30 million. So it would be like 7.5 million unemployed, which is far more than the official figure. So the official figure currently says about 1.7 million unemployed. They're even saying it may have gone down by a few thousand over the past quarter, but the rates are persistently high. But actually, another survey was published about the people who are expecting to lose their jobs coming out of furlough, and it will probably increase. Best estimates are that we'll go from 25 to 33% of the working population. A third of the working age population will be economically inactive. Now, some of those, of course, be very wealthy. The majority of them won't be. So you can see the kind of endemic levels. And some communities are hit much harder than others. The north and the south, there's a divide. Young and the old, there's a divide. There are divides between different ethnicities still. We've had an interesting report from the Race Equality Commission essentially saying there is no systemic racism left in the country. The beginning of the open admission of that systemic racial inequality in our country was, of course, the report around Stephen Lawrence's death. And the racism he encountered from the police officers who came to deal, as well as the racism of his attacker. But simultaneously with this report saying there's no longer any systemic racial bias in our society, we've seen that for young Black workers, their unemployment rate is 40%, whereas for young white workers, high as it is, you're probably talking about 12 to 13% official figures. These are still actually underrepresentation, but you can see unemployment and the problems it creates are massive in our country. And that's despite us being the sixth richest country in the world, where we're awash with capital, where that capital is going abroad to make bigger profits from lower wage workers abroad. But the entire world economy is in shambles, with more and more wealth occupied by coming to fewer and fewer hands. And all of the problems that we talk about are really derivative of that one original sin, which is the amassing of really what should be humanity's wealth, land, mines, mills, factories, all the means of production, distribution, exchange coming to fewer and fewer hands. And it's those people who are dictating policy rather than the people who ostensibly elect government. We can see there's so little representation. It's for that reason that we want people to get involved with the Workers' Party. We want them to come together with us to build a totally different kind of politics, actually representing working people. And that's why our candidates are standing in the forthcoming elections. We have a few questions that we'd like to get through. Tess, will you be introducing the people who are going to ask questions?
Might as well, seeing as I'm here. Okay, first up, we're going to have Dave. can unmute there, Dave.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Del.
Right. Sorry, I working on this. First of all, Dr. Bob and Dr. Ranjit, absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much. I think when we're in government, we've got our chief medical advisor and our secretary of state for health. You can work it out between you who's doing what, yeah. The reason one is Dr. Ranjit, a while back, he mentioned the covert takeover of our treasure, the NHS. I then spoke to a friend of mine to clarify some things. This is a friend in America whose husband was ill. You'll have to excuse me because I'll have to read it because it's not too long, but I do have to read it. Yeah. My question was, would you be left to die in the event of needing emergency care in America? This is where it came from. Her reply was, Dave Kerr, not left to die per se, but yes, the USA is only obliged to triage you in an emergency without prepayment. Any other services provided can and will be refused if you cannot pay. A doctor can refuse to see you if you have an insurance they cannot or will not accept payment through as well. Oh, and as a fun little bonus, even after paying over $800 per month for insurance, the company still makes their customers come up with about $3,000 to $5,000 US more before they will pay 80% of a bill. When my husband had his heart attack and bypass surgery, 3 weeks of medical care cost us over $25,000. That is what actually came out of our wallets after insurance paid their portion. And no, that doesn't include any medications, rehabilitation, or follow-up visits. That was hospital time only. I won't read the next bit, but she said, another thing is the ambulance was a separate bill of about $2,000 to drive him about 25 miles. And if you change jobs and have to get a different insurance because here it is tied to employment, the new company can refuse you cover as a customer due to pre-existing conditions. This is known in medical history everywhere else on the planet. That's what you wrote to me. I found that very, very interesting on our what Ranjit said. That was the idea of my question. This was a few weeks ago, Dr. Ranjit. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dave. I'm going to actually hand over to Bob pretty much to answer that. The smallest of reflections, you're absolutely right. There's a very good film by Michael Moore called Sicko, which kind of deals with those questions quite thoroughly and startlingly. But also, actually, Bob's latest movie, The Great NHS Heist, has a whole section where he, in fact, goes to America, interviews a whole number of people in connection with that, and is well worth your time to look at and everyone else's time to look at. But that is precisely the system we want to avoid, but we are getting ever closer to it. Interestingly, the one thing I will say is that we saw with the pandemic in the United States that the people who weren't uninsured suddenly mushroomed, because if you don't have a job, you don't have healthcare insurance. And suddenly, from allegedly being around 1 million, lots of precarious jobs, lots of people working 2 or 3 jobs, lots of people who are left out of those statistics, suddenly the figures became something like 60 or 70 million people who had no access to health insurance, who had no access to care. In the beginning, that was meaning they weren't able to get COVID tests. Clearly, there are people who are economically very marginalized and unable to isolate if they get COVID. So you can see just why the United States, as the richest country in the world, had in fact almost the worst rates of death and still is in the midst of its COVID pandemic. Bob, I'll hand over to you because I think your film is particularly relevant to that question.
Yeah, thank you. I think that example is, cuts to the heart of the matter. Privatized healthcare isn't interested in the poor. They're going to be left to their own devices. But the people with insurance are the targets of the insurance companies, because the only way you can make money is not to spend it on delivering care. So there are various ways of preventing people from seeking care. Very complex small print, these out-of-pocket expenses before even your cover kicks in. There's always that fear of losing your job. And the number one reason for household bankruptcy in the States is medical bills. And Ranjit, you're right. I think when the pandemic struck, millions of people were left without insurance when they lost their job. So for every million Americans uninsured, 1,000 premature deaths will occur per year. So yes, people are being left to die. In terms of getting emergency care, well, yes, you'll get emergency care, but what's happening in this country is they're closing your A&Es. So if your journey time doubles, and for every minute you're taking longer to get to hospital in a medical emergency, your mortality, your chances of dying goes up. And that's what they did in America. They had this where private hospital chains were buying out smaller hospitals only to shut them down and creating monopolies within states. So you'd have one provider being the dominant chain in a particular state, closing down all the neighboring competition, paying off their executives, and in essence, by means of reducing available services and increasing your distance, you are in effect killing people off. And that's the business model.
Thanks, Bob. Extremely powerful and harrowing testimony. But ultimately, we all have to understand capitalism is not concerned with the health of the poor. We're constantly told, it was the mantra of Gordon Brown and Tony Blair when they came into office, particularly Gordon Brown, that there's nothing more efficient than the free market. Now, if you mean efficient at making profit for its shareholders of companies and looking and prioritizing short-term profit, then you could probably argue that's true. But where health is concerned, and not only health, actually, increasingly you see more and more of the world's economy, education, really whatever the capitalists touch, but certainly with health, you can see there's a direct contradiction between best health outcomes for the population and most profit for the people administering the system under private care system. They're not synonymous. It's not going to be a peaceful marriage. It's going to be a battle. And in the current state of affairs, with the power resting in the hands of this wealthy corporate elite, patients, British patients, working class patients are going to be the loser. And this is where this is one of the richest countries on earth. You can imagine what's happening elsewhere where they don't even have, a national health system. So we really have to think about how we can change our country economically, but particularly in the short term, how we can unite an effective campaign around saving the NHS, which means so much to British working people. I think Ian Caruana has a question. Tess, are you able to help me put him on?
Hello, can you hear me? Hello there, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Ian.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Okay, right, fine. Yeah, thanks Bob and Ranjit for an excellent talk this evening. A couple of quick questions. First one is regarding the selling of the data, the NHS data. I just wonder if there's more to it than just the value of the data. Given that they're planning to take us in towards, should we say, an insurance-based system, is it not sort of possibly a first step for that, in the sense that the insurance companies would need that data to know how much to charge us if we're going to go to an insurance-based system? So that was the first question. Second one is basically personal experience just recently, something unrelated to the data, second subject. My father, unfortunately, has been moved into a care home very recently. It's I won't go into the details, but it's very traumatic, very emotionally draining experience. It's not something anyone wants to do, and yeah, I won't go through the details. But one of the comments that came up anyway, one of the care workers told me, I just wondered if you've got any thoughts on this at all, it was explained to me that there's different levels of care homes. It goes from extremely expensive to extortionately expensive, and somewhere in the middle. And it was explained to me that once you get assessed as to what level of care you need, and I think the top level of care is nursing home as opposed to maybe a care home, which is at the lower level. So it's the care home being the cheaper one, the nursing home being the more expensive one. If you get assessed as being the nursing home, even if my father was to improve, it is unlikely he would be assessed to go down to a care home because it would cost less money. So that's the two questions. I just wondered whether if you've heard that before. But for me, it's I don't know if it's true or not, but it's worrying the fact that I can actually believe it to be true. That's the main thing there for me. Just wondered if you'd heard anything on that at all. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian, for sharing that. So sorry for your problems. It's very distressing for all of us when our parents reach that age and start to have those problems. Of course, it's a great personal burden to us, and it's again for at least 30 years, our care system has been progressively privatized, and the re-merging of the health and care budgets hasn't been in favor of increased funding or renationalization. It's been in favor of dragging the NHS down the same route of progressive privatization. I think you're right. I think the data is a real issue. I mean, apart from the fact that it allows research and planning and is itself a rich tool, and has been just given away. The Royal Free, where I until recently worked, gave huge quantities of data away to the private sector, apparently without any remuneration. It's one of those well-connected hospitals where they often are trialing these ideas. But yeah, I think the GPs have been asked to gather a certain amount of information, which will be for example, dementia screening, which Bob will tell you more about, which is related to essentially levels of care that will be offered to patients and will be of key interest to health insurers as they take over the market. Bob, I'll welcome your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, thank you. Absolutely, the data has many uses. Insurance companies, in order for them to set your premium, the more you have wrong with you, the higher your premium. Hospital providers, they'll need all the data to submit an invoice. Increasingly, hospital discharge letters look like invoices. When I receive my patient discharge letter, there'll be a long list of the investigations, but none of the results. So not much use to me in terms of helping the care of my patient, but it's an itemized bill. So yes, that data will be used to set up this fully privatized market. What you describe in terms of care home and nursing home, any system which introduces money as the goal will introduce corruption and fraud and gaming. And if what the insurance companies and the providers are engaged in, they both have at least 10% of their profit streams coming through fraud. So a hospital provider, let's say you go in for a straightforward operation, well, they will bill for a more complex operation. And on the other hand, on the other side of that deal, you will have an insurance company will say, well, we think you didn't do as much as you're claiming for, or this patient doesn't qualify, or why did you keep them in for 5 days instead of 3 days? Now, not only does that waste a lot of manpower, time, and energy, a massive bureaucracy on the back of that, and massive data collection again. So probably the most concern I have in terms of, we're hearing about the vaccine passport, that will also very easily turn into an eligibility passport, which you show when you want to access services. Meaning there will be a second-class citizen who was ruled out of and unable to access the NHS. And there's also the merging of public health and the national security state. So you have a new department set up, so supposedly biosecurity. So you're having the pandemic being used as a mechanism to transfer a health problem over to the security infrastructure. Now, these are very worrying directions of travel. and if you combine that with attacks on civil liberties and the right to protest, it's not looking good. It looks almost like heading towards authoritarian, totalitarian control. So, in isolation, these things may seem individually harmless, but if you look at the bigger picture, it doesn't look very good.
Thanks, Bob. Excellent answers, and it reminded me of a couple more points probably worth making. One, Pfizer, one of the world's largest drug companies, based in the United States principally, has been caught up in many scandals in the United States, but one of them was one in which it was knowingly putting faulty mechanical heart valves into patients, thousands of patients affected. There were other scandals in the United States whereby hospitals were subjecting patients unnecessarily to a cardiac surgery. So, once you put the profit motive as central to your method of delivering care, then that has an overriding influence. People's personal pecuniary benefit, their willingness to make profit, their willingness to compromise decisions, their willingness to compromise care in order to maximize their personal profit. And of course, the person who will make the most, the organization which will make the most, will be the large health industries. But there's a corruption of everything they touch according to that profit motive, which throws out of the window then the concept of best medical practice, first do no harm, and makes that a secondary question, until of course it becomes a big scandal or care is compromised, when very much the insurance company will push the practitioner to the fore, and they will be the people who take the fall for this. You need to look at the opioid scandal in the United States to see the way in which the profits of a company led to widespread, a prescription of very strong opioids for minor ailments and no ailments, across the board, to patients, causing much more injury and harm than benefit or good. And you can see these examples again and again and again. So I think we have one more question. Chris, are we able to get Chris on, Tess?
You there, Chris?
Hello.
We got you. Go ahead, Dan.
Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead, Chris.
Oh, yeah. Hello, Ranjit. What you were saying about Dominic Cummings' approach to controlling the pandemic, and Boris Johnson's comments about how capitalism came up with the vaccine. I read that Cuba actually came up with the vaccine, and they controlled the coronavirus so well in their country that they couldn't test the vaccine on their own citizens, so they had to give it to Iran so they could test it for them. Have you heard anything about that?
Thanks, Chris. I think excellent points. I mean, the bottom line is, it's human ingenuity. It's scientists that come up with these discoveries and vaccines. Of course, large drug companies have a wealth of scientists working for them. They also take over smaller companies that come up with advances in order to market them and make the profit from their discoveries. So, ultimately it will be large conglomerates under capitalism who make money from it, but it's not large conglomerates who are responsible for driving innovation and technology forward. In fact, we've got to a stage of monopoly capitalism where they want to drag out profit. They want to use old technology. When old technology becomes too old in one market, they move it to the third world and sell old technology for as many years as they possibly can. We've had the scandal where old drugs that form off the formulary that should be relatively cheap to provide have had their licenses been brought up. And then these same old drugs, which used to be the staple of treatment, suddenly become incredibly expensive, 10, 12 times as expensive. And all of that money, it's got nothing to do with developing of new intellectual property, but simply just rinsing the healthcare system for everything they can get out of it. So yeah, you're quite right. It's human technology and innovation which comes up with it. Actually, it's a large financial contribution, even in the United States. So the Moderna vaccine had the benefit of hundreds of millions of subsidy from the United States state sector, not the private sector. And you're quite right, Cuba came up with, I think, 2 vaccines. China came up with 5 vaccines. Russia came up with 2 vaccines. So it's been by no means only the large Western multinational pharmaceutical companies that have come up with vaccine. But you have to say, human knowledge and ingenuity is what will develop the vaccine, as all other scientific advances. And you have to separate that from the economic system under which it lives. But it's always the mantra of capitalists, and really it's a dying system, a parasitic system, a corrupt system, a decaying system, which lives, vampire-like, by sucking the blood of the workers, particularly of the third world, but also our own country, which is currently, has concentrated so much wealth in the hands of the richest 3 individuals that they have more wealth than half the world's population. And therefore, the market can never provide for the interests of the poor, because they can never make money out of the poor. And as they impoverish more and more and more of the poor, they can't offer the benefits of human technology to an increasing mass, the majority of the world's population. So, the vaccination may get this country out of the coronavirus pandemic essentially relatively quickly, but it's going to be an ongoing problem for much of the world, as so many other preventable and treatable diseases. We've seen close to 3 million people die of coronavirus pandemic, but of course, every year we see 14 million children dying from malnutrition and related diseases, 30 or 40 million people worldwide dying essentially from impoverishment at the hands of this system. And of course, that poverty has a knock-on effect in trying to deal with the pandemic. So you're quite right. Socialist countries like Cuba have emphasized the need to care for their people. We can provide for the world a much higher standard of living than is currently enjoyed by an average middle-class person in Britain on a global basis, but it means providing it in a different way. It's that change of, redistribution of resources. There's nothing natural that half the, 3 people have more money than half the world's population. That is artificially propped up by state intervention, by military intervention around the world whenever people try and reorganize their local economy, nationalize their goods, nationalize their oil, nationalize their raw materials, their industries, so that they can have a better standard of life. Currently, United States, Britain, NATO countries have a tendency to politically intervene, destabilize, and ultimately invade other countries in order to perpetuate their current system of really what amounts to global domination. So, we're dealing with the NHS. We have to have a look at the wider political context in which this is running. And it's precisely for these reasons that we in the Workers' Party are very keen to pursue a project of enlisting the best elements, the most aware, enlightened elements of the working class, who can see what's happening, who are now getting disillusioned with the fact that they've been betrayed again and again, year after year, by the Labour Party, by the Tory Party, by the Liberal Party, and by the Scottish Nationalist Party. And we need to develop a way that we can challenge this prevailing economic orthodoxy with all its knock-on for our health, for our schooling, for our children, for our employment, for our communities. And so I would encourage everyone who hasn't, please look at Bob Gill's film, The Great NHS Heist. I would encourage everyone who hasn't, please, to go to our petition, the Corona Tax petition, www.coronatax.org. Have a look at the very reasonable demands we're making of how during this time when the working class have been especially hard hit by the pandemic and the economic crisis, what we should be doing is levying the wealth that exists in this country to alleviate some of the most immediate and pressing problems of the working people. We're doing actually the reverse, and the tax burden for the spend, which has gone to the very wealthy, will fall on the sections of the working class who currently fit most of the tax bill. That is what's actually happening. So please look at that, sign up to that Corona tax petition, get involved with the Workers' Party, and help us build a new working class politics in Britain. Bob, is there anything you'd like to say before we wrap up the meeting?
Overall, I'd just like to reiterate a couple of points. We're very far down the road in terms of NHS privatization. Most people will feel it when they no longer have access to a local doctor that they know. We're in danger of losing that doctor-patient relationship, and converting doctor as being your advocate to doctor as being your enemy, who will act against your interest and be incentivized to increase their own incomes by denying you care. And the imminent threats are the shake-up, which is going to create American-style integrated care systems, far from it being a reversal of privatization, it's a locking in. And I think the final nail in the coffin will be the legal handcuff of a US-UK trade deal, which will protect the contracts that are going to be signed over to American corporations. So as much as we can do to raise public awareness and really get them focusing on the threat, that's where we need to direct our energies. And thank you for inviting me.
Fantastic, Bob. Thank you so much. I think that's an excellent place to end. Please, everyone, if you haven't looked at the 10-point program of the Workers' Party, do so. I think we want to be integral to building a campaign to save our National Health Service, for renationalisation of the National Health Service, for abolition of the ongoing obligation to repay the private finance initiative. And that's got to be a broad-based campaign centred around workers within the National Health Service, but particularly the communities who are dependent upon it. So please get involved with us, and we will pledge to continue to work to advance that demand within the working class and build an effective campaign to try and stem and reverse the direction of travel, which left to this government and the current opposition will continue. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks, Ranji, and thank you to Dr. Bob Gill, thank you to Liam and to all our contributors. We'll see you all after the elections. Take care, take it easy, have fun, and stay safe. Night, night, Nostar.